Thanks very much, Andrew, and good evening, everybody. Right. Apologies about the technical glitches. These things happen. Okay, so a few weeks ago we discussed the introduction to Daniel 11, and we have action, which is very good. And we noted that so detailed and so accurate is the outworking of Daniel 11 that a common theme is that, this is touted as prophecy, but it's not really prophecy, it's history. It's simply not possible, say the skeptics, to predict so accurately the interactions of the successors of Alexander the Great. We noted that the prophecy commences from the fall of Babylon and continues to the return of Jesus Christ. We noted that there were 3 kings to follow Cyrus, the 4th, Xerxes, being far richer than them all. And we explored the foundation of the campaign that Xerxes would stir up against the regions of Greece. And that was triggered by a revolt of a group of people in southwestern Turkey, known then as Ionia, and Darius, against whom the revolt was launched, determined to punish them, determined to punish Greece, but was significantly defeated at the Battle of Marathon, and that was a significant turning point. So at this point, Darius decided to raise a new army to subjugate Greece, and it's a great pity indeed that he could not resort to Daniel's prophecy, because that would have told him from chapter 4, verse 17, that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and gives them to whomsoever he will. And it was not in the plan of the Most High that the Persians should overrun Greece. Acts 17, verse 26 tells us that God has appointed before time the bounds of the nations, the times and the bounds of the nations. So Darius, having been humbled at the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC, determined to raise up a new army, but his plans were thwarted by a revolt in Egypt. So whilst he was quelling the Egyptian revolt, he died in 485 BC, and his son Xerxes ascended the throne, and then by 484 BC had effectively subdued the Egyptian revolt. Now at this stage, Xerxes took 4 years to amass the largest army ever seen, and curiously he had the support of some parts of Greece, the support of Thessaly, Thebes and Argos, which are various Greek cities. Okay, a relief from text. This is a picture of a carving where Darius designates Xerxes as his successor. Okay. So, Xerxes launched his campaign to subdue Greece. Unfortunately, the campaign didn't get off to a good start. The navy was caught in a gale off Magnesia on the eastern side of Greece, losing some 400 out of 1,200 ships. At the naval battle of Artemisium, Xerxes faced an alliance of Greeks, which was actually quite remarkable because at the time, many of these were technically still at war. Nevertheless, they put aside their quarrels to face the common danger. Another 200 of the Persian ships were shipwrecked in a storm. And whilst the Persians did join battle, the Greeks ended up withdrawing their fleet to Salamis, and then came the infamous land battle of Thermopylae. The Greeks held the only road. The Persians were shown a bypass to outflank the Greeks. And then Leonidas, the king of Sparta, with 300, fought the Persians, allowing most of the Greek army to retreat to safety, and that significantly delayed the Persian advance. So here now is a picture of the general campaign against Greece that traces the Persian fleets, which ultimately came to this area of Salamis here, which proved critical, and there is Thermopylae, which allowed time for the Greek armies to retreat to relative safety. This is a picture of how the Persians outflanked the Greeks and came behind them at Thermopylae, and this is a picture of an Ionian and Carian soldiers, groups of soldiers who joined the Persian army in the campaign against Greeks. And that's an artist's illustration of the resistance of Leonidas at Thermopylae to hold up the Persian advance. So the Persians continued their campaign, and it seemed to go okay. They took Plataea and Thespiae and then went on to Athens, which the Persians then destroyed. And then, in a classic step, the Persian navy was lured to Salamis as a result of a massive Greek disinformation campaign. The Persians sailed to Salamis thinking that the Greek coalition had fallen apart. What had happened was that the Persians were then lured into a very constricted area, and then in the Battle of Salamis in 480 BC, the Persian navy was decisively defeated. As a result, Xerxes ordered most of his army to retreat to Asia. He left a hand-picked force to subdue the Greeks, but then came two other battles, and these two battles destroyed forever the Persian hope of subduing Greece. And from that time onward, the Persians gave up any attempt to subdue the Greek states. Not that they actually had too much to worry about, because as soon as the danger was over, the Greek states went to doing what they do best, fighting each other. This is an artist's illustration of the Persian and Spartan armies fighting at the Battle of Plataea. Now, back to Daniel 11 and verse 4, verse 3. A mighty king shall stand up, that shall rule. So, what's this talking about? Now, it's verse 4 that gives us the clue. When he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken. So this mighty king who stands up and has his kingdom broken is that of the kingdom of the Greeks and Macedonians. So what about the rest of the Persian kings after Xerxes? None of them featured prominently, and therefore prophecy simply skips over them. The following Persian kings were simply not worthy of a mention in prophecy. Now, we might just take a pause for a moment and have a look at chapter 8 and verse 5. Daniel chapter 8 and verse 5, because chapter 11 is written against a background of what's gone before. So chapter 8 verse 5 tells us that there was a he-goat, came from the west on the face of the whole earth. The goat had a notable horn between his eyes, and then it goes on to say, verse 8, that the he-goat waxed very great. When he was strong, the great horn was broken, and for it came up four notable ones towards the four winds of heaven. So, as time went by, the province of Macedonia grew stronger and stronger until Philip of Macedon restored its fortunes and conquered the Greek city-states one by one and fused them into a coherent empire. The last resistance of the Greeks occurred at a battle of Chaironeia in 338 BC, and at that battle, now with all the Greek city-states united to Macedonian, Philip of Macedon declared war on Persia, but was assassinated in 336 BC. His son Alexander III, otherwise known as the Great, becomes king, and then began his invasion of the Persian Empire in 334 BC. That's a picture of Daniel chapter 7, the image of the Third Empire, the Greco-Macedonian, showing the four heads of the leopard and the four wings, emphasising that it was an empire, started off as a united empire, but then was divided. So briefly then, Alexander the Great fought the Battle of the Granicus. He fought the Battle of Issus in 333 BC, and it went badly for the Greeks until Alexander broke through the Persian line and attacked Darius III directly, and he fled, and then his whole army disintegrated. The final battle was at a place called Arbela or Gaugamela, which is somewhere to the east of the modern city of Mosul. And with that battle, the whole of the Persian Empire fell under the reign of Alexander the Great. Now, not content with conquering the Medo-Persian Empire, Alexander pushed eastward and fought the Battle of the Hydaspes, which brought Pakistan into Alexander's empire. And there's the Greek phalanx attacking the centre of the army of Hydaspes, and that was a painting by Andrei Castagny. Right, okay, there we are. This then was the extent of Alexander's empire. To the west, it fronted Greece, much of modern Greece, Thrace, Macedonia, much of modern Turkey, Syria, Israel, Egypt, and then on through modern Iraq, Iran, right over to the borders of India. Alexander would have kept on further were it not for the fact that his troops mutinied. Even hardened soldiers know when they've had enough. I won't spend too much time. These trace the route of Alexander's campaign, leading finally to the Battle of the Hydaspes, as we mentioned earlier. Now, Daniel 11 tells us that when Alexander stands up, his kingdom shall be broken and shall be divided into the four winds of heaven. Now, we've seen that reflected before. Alexander died at Babylon in 323 BC. And incredibly, before he was even buried, his top generals argued over the spoils. Now, the arrangement was that Alexander's son would inherit the empire, and Alexander's favourite wife, Roxane, did indeed bear him a son. No problem, both he and his mother were ruthlessly slain. And furthermore, the entire royal family of Macedon was destroyed before we get to 300 BC. Now, from Alexander's empire, 4 divisions occurred. One headed up by a gentleman called Antipater, Macedonia and Greece, Phrygia and Lycia by Antigonus, Egypt by Ptolemy, and Thrace by Lysimachus. And the Greeks did what they did best. They fought each other. And there are a whole series of campaigns until we get to 301 BC, when there was the final division into the 4 empires after 22 years of continuous warfare. There's a picture of the goat with the horn broken and the other 4 horns in its place. And you'll notice a reference there to the little horn of the goat in Daniel 8, but we're not going down that path tonight. Now, from this point onward, Daniel 11 confines itself to the discussion of the kings of the south and the north. South of where? North of where? Verse 30 and 32 tell us where south and north is relative. 11 verse 30. The ships of Chittim shall come against him, he'll be grieved and return and have indignation against the holy covenant. He'll even return and have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. Now those who were involved with the holy covenant were clearly in the land of Judah or Judea. Verse 32, such as do wickedly against the covenant, he'll corrupt by flatteries, but the people that know their God shall be strong and do exploits. So this is centred on the province of Judea, and therefore north and south is north and south of Judea. It is a principle of prophecy that nations are discussed when they interact with God's people. Now, this is probably not a completely accurate statement. Whilst Daniel 11 makes no reference to the kings of Persia after Xerxes, there is in Ezra and Nehemiah a reference to the son of Xerxes called Artaxerxes, and it was he who gave Ezra the authority to re-establish to beautify the temple in Jerusalem, and who authorised Nehemiah to restore the walls of Jerusalem. But prophetically, that was the only interaction the Persians had with the people of God. And likewise, there's no discussion of all the conquests of Alexander the Great. So then, who was the king of the north? That kingdom embraced modern Turkey, Syria, Iraq and Iran to the Indus River. The king of the south, south of Judah, embraced Libya, Egypt, at that time Israel, also the West Bank. And there was a sad repeat of history because Israel was caught between clashes of the kingdoms of the north and the south. So, for example, we read in Kings that Assyria and Egypt battled for control, and often those campaigns involved armies marching to and from the kingdom of Judah. Later on, the same thing happened between the Chaldean Empire and the kingdom of Egypt. And so it means that other kingdoms from Alexander's empire were simply ignored. There were 4 divisions, only 2 are mentioned, the 2 that had direct interaction with the kings of the south and the north. So on this map here, we've shown the 4 divisions of Alexander's empire as at 301 BC, and the 2 divisions that we're most concerned with, the king of the south centred on Egypt, and the king of the north centred basically on Syria and eastern Turkey, but extending deep into modern Iraq, Iran and so forth. Now, from this point onwards, how might we best consider the detail in Daniel chapter 11? And for better or for worse, the basic strategy I've decided on is to list each verse and then discuss the activity that went on. So verse 5 says, the king of the south shall be strong, one of his princes and so forth. The first Ptolemy, number 1, had the surname or the epithet of Sota, and he it was, incidentally, who began the construction of one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the lighthouse of Alexandria. Okay, now verse 6, in the end of years they shall join themselves together. What happened here is that the second Ptolemy and the second Antiochus agreed to a marriage. Berenice was the daughter of Ptolemy II, and she agreed to marry Antiochus, and hopefully they might have calmed down and settled things down. Unfortunately for Antiochus to marry Berenice, he had to divorce his first wife, Laodice. Beware the fury of a woman scorned. Because what happened? Well, Laodice, Philadelphus, the second Ptolemy, died. Berenice had no protectors, and she and her entourage were murdered. So the record says, she shall not retain the power of her arm, neither shall he stand, nor his arm. She shall be given up. But that wasn't the end of the matter. The son of Berenice, Euergetes, invaded, captured Antioch, and slew those who had murdered his mother, Berenice. Verse 8, he shall also carry captives into Egypt, their gods, their princes, and so forth. We see here that he spoiled the northern kingdom. He reigned a further 37 years, and the king of the north, incidentally, ended up dying in a prison in Parthia. And so the king of the south returned in triumph to his kingdom. Now, verse 10 tells us that his sons shall be stirred up and assemble a multitude of great for. So the sons of the king of the north did indeed assemble a large army and went through the Middle East, occupying Syria and Galilee. Galilee was the territory of the king of the south, and then went into winter quarters in Ptolemais. Now, arguably, the king of the south was very upset about this. He was moved with choler. He would come and fight against the king of the north. And it says that Antiochus had 72,000 foot and 6,000 horses. Sorry about that. But, no. Try again. But the king of the south won a great victory. The multitude, it says, shall be given into his hand. The king of the south was elated by his victory. Verse 12, his heart will be lifted up. He'll cast out many 10,000, but he shall not be strengthened by it. Why was that? Because he tried to enter the holy place in Jerusalem, but he suddenly fell ill and died. Verse 13, the king of the north shall return and set forth a multitude greater than the former, and shall certainly come after certain years. After 19 years, the king of the north, Antiochus, came and recovered Syria and Palestine for his rulership. Verse 14 tells us that many shall stand up against the king of the south, also the robbers of thy people. We learned that at this time the king of the south was only an infant, and there were a number of plots raised against that king of the south. However, a new power intervened, the Romans who would prove to be the robbers of Daniel's people at the time, later when they would sack the temple at Jerusalem in AD 70. The Romans intervened and became a power in Egypt and warned off those confederate against the Egyptian king. The king of the north was infuriated by these events and came and cast up a mount, took most of the fenced cities, and he besieged Sidon, and he also captured Jerusalem, and the Egyptian, the king of the south, was unable to stem his advance. In verse 16, he that comes against him shall do according to his own will. That is to say, the king of the north would do as he pleased. No one should stand before him. He stood in the glorious land which by his hand was consumed. The king occupied Palestine and the land was devastated. It then says that he will enter with the strength of his whole kingdom and upright ones with him. He then set his face to capture Greece and sought Jewish help. He also gave his daughter, the king of the north gave his daughter to the king of the south to at least secure his neutrality. So it says he'll give him the daughter of women, corrupting her, but she shall not stand on his side, neither be for him. What happened was that she sided with her husband against her father. Not a good thing to do. So verse 18 tells us that Antiochus initially succeeded in his campaign against the Isles and shall take money. But a prince for his own behalf shall cause the reproach offered by him to cease. Now, what actually happened at this time was that Rome had guaranteed the autonomy, if you like, of the various Greek states at that time. Antiochus had successfully insulted the Romans by conquering those Greek states, and the Romans accordingly launched an army and engaged him at Thermopylae, and a crushing defeat at Magnesia in 190 BC. So he now, the king of the north, was reproached, and he was forced into a humiliating treaty which required him to abandon all claims to the western part of modern Turkey, and it also required him to pay a tribute. And so it says in verse 19, he shall turn his face toward the fort of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall and not be found. What happened was that the king decided that he would raid a temple of Jupiter and loot it in 187 BC. But the provincials, exasperated by this robbery, went and murdered him. Verse 20 tells us, there shall stand up in his estate a raiser of taxes in the glory of the kingdom. The son of the king of the north, Seleucus IV, had the job of raising the taxes during his 12-year reign to pay the tribute that the Romans imposed after the Battle of Magnesia. And then it tells us that he will destroy neither in anger nor in battle, because having succeeded in raising the taxes and paying off what the Romans demanded, somebody decided they'd had enough of him and he was poisoned. And verse 21 says that in his estate shall stand up a vile person. His gentleman by the name of Heliodorus, which was one of his senior courtiers, was the one who poisoned him and sought to seize the kingdom, but the ruling authorities of that kingdom were not prepared to grant it to him. Instead, another one, would come in peaceably and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. This was a gentleman a bit more infamous. His name was Antiochus IV. He was surnamed Epiphanes. I was saying to someone earlier this evening that Epiphanes means the shining one or the revealed one or the splendid one. He was also nicknamed Epinomes, which means the mad one. So Antiochus Epiphanes, through flatteries, obtained the kingdom, and as a result, Heliodorus was promptly put to death. So verse 22 tells us that with an arms of the flood they shall be overthrown. Ptolemy decided, with all the heave-ho going on in the king of the north, demanded restitution of Palestine and Syria, and he marched to battle against the king of the north, but was overwhelmed and defeated. Egypt was invaded, and furthermore, it also says, when it says, and shall be broken also the prince of the covenant. Not only was the king of the south broken in that campaign, but Onias, the high priest himself, was murdered in 172 BC. Verse 23 says, after the league made with him, he shall work deceitfully. They did make peace, the kings of the south and north, but what happened was Antiochus Epiphanes arrived in Alexandria with a small force and established himself in Egypt, no doubt saying he was there to enforce the treaty or something. It says he shall enter peaceably, verse 24, on the fattest places of the provinces, and shall do that which his fathers have not done, nor his fathers' fathers, verse 24. By intrigue, Antiochus Epiphanes did what his predecessors were unable to do. He was able to secure Egypt and divide it up amongst his soldiers. And of course, the Egyptian king could do next to nothing about it. But he was still the Egyptian king and he needed to be dispatched. So the king of the north, based in Alexandria, verse 25, stirred up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army. The king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with another great army, but he shall not stand, because they shall forecast devices. So the king of the north, Epiphanes, raised a large army against the king of the south, Plataea. He was undermined when the people of Alexandria crowned his brother king in his place. So the king of the north's able to do pretty much as he will. But then the courtiers of King Philommeter also turned against him, which led to the defeat of the Egyptian army. Now, after this campaign, both kings decided to sit down and draw up some sort of peace treaty, but they were intent on practicing deception. Verse 28, he shall return to his land with great riches, and his heart shall be against the holy covenant. So the king of the north, Antiochus Epiphanes, now attacked Jerusalem, sacked the temple, killed 80,000 Jews and sold another 40,000 into slavery in 169 BC. Now, at this time, there were two kings in Egypt. A king who'd been dethroned, another king whom the Alexandrian people appointed. And so Epiphanes decided that he would restore the former king to the throne of Egypt as a puppet king. However, it turned out that both kings agreed to a joint reign, and this time they asked for Roman assistance. So the king of the north decided he'd go to campaign, and he was initially successful, but it says in verse 29, it shall not be as the former or as the latter, because now a new power intervened called the ships of Chittim to come against him. Now the story goes that when Egypt was about to fall totally into the hands of Epiphanes, a Roman ambassage came to him and demanded that he evacuate Egypt. And furthermore, the Roman ambassage met him and drew a circle in the earth. He said, don't step outside that circle until you've made a decision. Epiphanes had no choice but to submit to the Roman demand that he evacuate Egypt. So therefore he shall be grieved and return and have indignation against the Holy Covenant. He vented his rage on Jerusalem, but he made an alliance with unfaithful Jews and left a general by the name of Apollonius to finish the subjugation and destruction of Jerusalem. So it was that Apollonius destroyed much of Jerusalem, verse 31. They shall pollute the sanctuary of strength. He profaned the temple. He slew worshippers in the temple's court. And then it says, he shall take away the daily sacrifice. Another general suppressed the daily sacrifice, placing images of Jupiter in the temple, decreed Jews keep his religion, the Greek religion, and proceeded to seize and burn all copies of the scriptures. And the abomination that makes desolate has reference, among other things, to the idolatry, the images placed in God's temple. Faithless Jews supported these measures, verse 32. Such as do wickedly against the covenant shall he corrupt by flatteries, but the people that know their God shall be strong and do exploits. Faithless Jews supported the measures that the Greeks imposed. However, there was a family of Matthias who was the high priest, and that family defended the law and unexpectedly proved valiant in battle. They didn't all get their own way, however. Verse 33, they that understand among the people shall instruct many, yet they shall fall by the sword, by flame, by captivity, and by spoil many days. And so it was that despite their support for the law, Matthias and many of his sons died in battle in a period 168 to 161 BC. Judas Maccabeus, one of the sons, raised the standard of revolt against the king of the north in 163 BC. Now, we're told in verse 34 that when they shall fall, they shall be helped with a little help. The Maccabees had so few resources against what the king of the north could command, and yet they achieved some amazing outcomes. With just small armies, they inflicted great defeats on the armies of the king of the north. Now then we come to an important verse, verse 35. And here we have a transition. Now I say it's a transition because at this point, discussion of the kings of the south and the north cease at this point. Now they're going to come up again later on, but at this point, we've had a continuous history of the kings of the south and the north, and that is now ceased. Some of them of understanding shall fall to try and to purge and to make them white, even to the time of the end. So the focus switches away from them to those of understanding. It would be a difficult time for those who would want to serve God, but they would be tried, purged, and made white. Let's have a look, shall we, at Hebrews 12, verses 4 to 7. Hebrews 12, verses 4 to 7. There the writer says, "You have not yet resisted to blood, striving against sin. And you have forgotten the exhortation which speaks to you as children. My son, do not despise the chastening of the Lord, nor faint when you are rebuked of him. For whom the Lord loves, he chastens and scourges every son whom he receives. If you endure chastening, God deals with you as with sons. For what son is there whom the Father chastens not?" So here were people at this critical juncture of Jewish history who were tried, purged, and made white. Now, of course, there's always been a faithful remnant, as 1 Kings 19 emphasises for us, but at the time from 163 BC onwards, the Jews gained a great measure of independence, and there was in fact a resurgence of a faithful nation. And yet, for all that, disaster overtook them again. Why is that? Verse 35, they were to make them white even to the time of the end, because it is yet for a time appointed. The Maccabees had achieved a wonderful result and had raised the Jewish adherence to the law and faithfulness, and gained a great measure of independence, which allowed them to rule very much in their own right. But the Maccabees were not the end, because it is yet for a time appointed. In 140 BC, Simon Maccabee was recognised as the high priest and the ruler, the king of Israel. But sure enough, a civil war broke out between the descendants of the Maccabees, a civil war in which the Romans intervened and Judea became a client kingdom of Rome. Now, that's a lot of history, a lot of detail. Why do we have this detail? Because, as we said last time, the Lord God does nothing, but he reveals his secret to his servants, the prophets. Now, could anyone living at the time of, say, Daniel 11 verse 5, look forward and say, this king will do that and that king will do that and so forth? No, not necessarily. But as they lived through those times, they could see how they were fulfilled. Now, is that relevant for us? Yes. We say we live in the time of the end. Why do we say that? The tumult among nations, the bitterness of conflicts, Armenia versus Azerbaijan, the fact that the world seems unable to grapple with the coronavirus. Australia's done better than most. But sometime, if things continue as they were, we have a $200 billion debt to pay off. Okay? So, we are living through those times, and it is living through the times that we come to see the hand of God in prophecy. And of course, we've stopped at verse 35, leads us to say what Daniel would, what we can see looking back, is that beyond that time, the rest of Daniel chapter 11 and chapter 12 will be just as surely fulfilled.